introduced, many of you know, Ambassador Bill Taylor, Vice President, Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and as the U.S. Ambassador in Ukraine from 2006 to 2009, and I've been asked several times which president. Under which president?
President Trump.
Trump, okay. During the Arab Spring.
6 to 9.
No.
6 to 9 was under President Bush.
Bush.
And then a little bit under President Obama. And then back in 2019 under President Trump.
Okay. Did everyone hear that? Okay. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served in Jerusalem as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet. He served in Kabul in 2002 and Baghdad 2004. In the 1990s, he coordinated the U.S. assistance to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He earlier served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley. But Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. Welcome, Bill. Okay. Now, we had an earlier event around noon, and Bill did great. He just got up and talked, and I offered that tonight, but he said, no, we're going to talk today. So
let's talk.
What we want to do is talk a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I also want to acknowledge our Ukrainian community over in the table in the far corner here. Thank you for being here tonight. Okay, so you just got back what day from Ukraine? Like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday?
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Tuesday, yeah.
So he's here today. Now that's a 9-hour time change?
Let's see, 10.
10 hours.
10 hours, right? It's,
yeah.
From here to Kyiv, it's 10 hours.
So you're still upright and talking. I'm
Here
impressed.
We are.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you to kind of bring us up to speed about your trip, but also maybe give some, background, like you did this afternoon. Kind of go back and show us your map, and then we'll get into some more questions.
Okay, good. Maybe I'll just.
I knew you'd do that.
So just because we can talk about this map. So yes, I have been back to your country 8 times since the big war. And the most recent one was this past week. It's incredible. I really enjoy going back every time, even though it's tough, it's grim. I keep track, many people do. The Ukrainians have been fighting the Russians for 967 days since the big war. They've been fighting for 10 years since Russia first invaded. They first invaded in 2014. But for the last 967 days, an intense war is going on there. And the support that the United States provides to Ukraine is crucially important. So one of the reasons I really appreciate, Reverend Cindy, being able to come here and talk to people in this room and in other parts of the city is that support is crucially important, I think, to us, to the United States. And people will ask, why is that? Why should we in Orange County, California, or in Arlington, Virginia, why should we care a whole lot about what goes in Ukraine? And we know there are some politicians who say they don't care about Ukraine. So I would like to argue with those people. I would like to talk a little bit about why I go back, Cindy, your question. And that is Ukraine's success is our success. As we talked about earlier, the Ukrainian army, a lot of your colleagues are fighting on our behalf. So this map just reminds us that Russia trying to take over Ukraine, and really that's what President Putin has said he wants to do. President Putin has said that he doesn't think your country, he doesn't think Ukraine is really a country. He thinks it's really just part of Russia, and so if he can just take it back then that's what he's after. He wants to take over Ukraine, and that's what he tried to do in 2014 and then in 2022. And so Ukrainians are trying to stop him. They're defending their country. They're defending their communities. They're defending their nation. And at the same time, they're defending us. So I think it's really important for us to be able to make the case on this. So
Democracy, too.
So Cindy, let me just try to, I'm not sure what the best way to do it. Probably here.
That way.
Right. So just to remind us, here's Ukraine and its 1991 borders, and so that's an important number. Ukraine got its independence in 1991, and everyone in the world, including the Russians, recognized the boundaries, the borders, the 1991 borders of Ukraine. Internationally recognized, no questions. And as I say, in 2014, they invaded these two parts of Ukraine, Crimea and Donbass. And in 2022, they took more. And so now the Russians occupy 20% of Ukraine. And this 80% still gets bombed, still gets attacked from the air, but is not under siege from the Russian military, Russian army. There's one, you can't really see this, but there's a little red spot here. And this red spot here is a recent operation by the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military moved into Russia and so Russia was invaded by the Ukrainian military, first time since World War II. And now they occupy and control a small bit, I mean, again, you can't see it very well, but it's right here, a small bit of Ukraine, which gives them leverage when the time comes, when the Russians figure out that they can't win, and the Russians decide that they're going to try to come and negotiate a way out. This little bit of Russia that Ukrainians occupy will come in handy for those negotiations on this thing. So that was Cindy, a long.
Three really good reasons to the reason.
So the first reason that I think that we should care about is one I've already talked about. That is, it's the security reason. So the Ukrainians are defending Europe and NATO right here, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, where there are U.S. troops. U.S. troops, we're part of that NATO alliance, and we've got troops in this part of the world, and the Ukrainians are holding the Russians back from this part of the world. So in some real sense, the Ukrainians are defending NATO's eastern flank. And if the Russians get all the way to that flank, they don't stop. The Russians keep going. That's a security threat to the United States. So the first answer to Reverend Cindy's question about what are the three reasons, one is security for our own self. Our own military, our own soldiers will be threatened if the Russians are able to move all the way there. The second is more of a kind of a geopolitical reason, but it's also it's the question of what kind of world do we want to live in, want our kids to live in, to want our grandchildren to live in? Is it a world where big nations like Russia can invade their neighbors, that can grab territory, like 20% of their neighbors' territory? And if Russia gets away with that, what's to stop other dictators from doing the same thing? From 1945 until 2014, there was a general understanding, a general acceptance of the principle that nations are sovereign. Nations can govern themselves, and that borders, like these 1991 borders of Ukraine, are to be respected. And that respect for sovereignty of nations and for the borders of your neighbors basically kept the peace, at least in terms of great power conflict in Europe. We didn't have another world war during that time from 1945 until 2014. The Russians trashed those principles when they invaded Ukraine, and they're trying to establish another principle, which is big nations can invade little nations. And that's not a world that I think we want to live in. I don't want to live in. I don't want my kids or grandchildren to live in there. And the third reason is a moral one, and that is, it's just wrong for what the Russians have done. I mean, not only is it wrong to invade your neighbor, but it's wrong to commit these atrocities. I mean, the atrocities in Irpin and Bucha are the ones that are right around Kyiv, just right around here. That's where the Russians came down from the north, but also from the east and from the south. But when they came down here in Bucha and Irpin, just on the outskirts of Kyiv, they committed atrocities that and in other places as well. I mean, that's not the only place, but the two little towns that are now sadly very famous for the atrocities that the Russians have: assassinations, torture, rape, kidnapping. The Russians are kidnapping Ukrainian children, taking them back into Russia, taking their names, their passports, their families away, and which is a war crime, for which Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court as a war criminal. So he's an indicted war criminal for that as well as these other ones. So there's a moral. So there's a security one that the Ukrainians are defending us as members of NATO. There is this geostrategic one which says what kind of world do we want to live in? And then there's the moral one that is wrong. If we want to have some hope that this won't happen again, we have to hold the Russians accountable for their atrocities.
And Bill, you mentioned before that the impetus of Putin just kind of saying, okay, I'm going in, was watching Afghanistan. Do you think that had a really large impact on him?
So I do. I'm pretty sure that, well, we know that President Putin for a long time has wanted to control Ukraine. And it's not, I should just say, it's not really Putin. I mean, again, our Ukrainian friends back here will help me with this, with the Ukrainian history, but they've lived for 300 years under threat from the Russians, from whether it's the Tsars or the Soviets or now Putin. It goes back a long time that the Russians have tried to oppress and absorb Ukraine. And so when Putin came in, it was not really a surprise, but he put it very explicitly. He wrote it down and put it in speeches where he said, Ukraine doesn't exist. It's not a real country. So I'm just going to take it back. And that has demonstrated what he is.
All for his legacy?
It's the right question. What's in his mind that drives this? And people who've studied President Putin much more than I have, say that his motivation, what he really is after, he wants to be seen and heard and remembered as a great Russian leader, like Catherine the Great, Peter the Great. He thinks, oddly, that Stalin was a great Russian leader. So he would like to be in that same category. And in order to do that, he thinks he needs to take over Ukraine. That's been the drive.
And economically, what is he after also? Like the grain and the ports and the...
Well, his main motivation is to dominate Ukraine, and one way to do that is to...
But also dominate the region, too. I mean,
dominate the region, but is to smash the economy and the drivers of the economy. And so he's really gone after electrical generation and distribution capacity in Ukraine. So there's about half the pre-war capacity is destroyed. So every Ukrainian, all across the country, not just in the occupied territories, all across the country, are facing blackouts, rolling blackouts.
Yeah.
Think about what electricity does. I mean, they're on the left bank of Kyiv. I spent a lot of time in Kyiv, and on the left bank there are a lot of high-rise apartments. And 20 floors up, if you don't have electricity, a couple things happen. One is you don't have water, because the electricity drives the water pumps. And so in order to have water, you walk down 20 floors, and you fill up, and then you walk back up carrying water, heavy. You can't get in the elevators because if the electricity's out, they're not running. But even if the electricity is there, you're not sure you'll get all the way down. You could be stuck. Attacking the electricity is really affecting people, individual people, as well as the economy, as you say. The other thing they did, Reverend Cindy, is tried to stop the exports out of Odessa.
Right.
So Odessa is the biggest, not the only port, but Odessa's here. Mykolaiv, Kherson, Melitopol, Mariupol, all were export ports. And Ukraine exports a lot of grain, of sunflower oil, of metals, and that is the driver for the economy. So if the Russians can cut off the ports, they can have, again, a really negative effect. So Ukraine, this is very interesting. The Ukrainians have pushed the Russian Navy out of the eastern part of the Black Sea. So the Black Sea, this is the Black Sea right here, right? Crimea is stuck down into the Black Sea. And the Russians tried to cut off Odessa, the port, but the Ukrainians, without a navy, so there's a couple of Navy people in this room here, I know we talked about. Ukrainians, without a navy of their own, have been able to push the Black Sea fleet out of the western part of the Black Sea using drones, using maritime drones, and inflicting so much damage on the Russian Black Sea fleet that they had to move it out of Sevastopol, which is right at the bottom here, all the way over to the eastern part of the Black Sea, in order to open up those export zones. So this is an intentional tactic of the Russians trying to cut them off.
Two questions, and I know you love two questions.
I have a hard, as we get older, we have a harder time remembering the two questions. But
They're related.
Okay, they're related.
Okay.
All right.
So I kind of want to pin you down. How do you feel about us holding back weaponry to go into Moscow? And then the second question is, how has...
Well, I'm sorry, the first question is what?
The first question is, why aren't we allowing Ukraine, or how do you feel about Ukraine being able to attack directly into Russia? And the second question, which I find really interesting, is how has Ukraine changed warfare?
So one of the policy questions right now is the first one you asked.
Yeah.
That is, will the United States allow the Ukrainians to use weapons that we've given them, that provided them?
How do you feel about it too?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
I know the question. We have said the U.S. position so far is that the Ukrainians should not use these weapons, these long-range weapons, the Army tactical missile, the ATACMS missile system, to fire deep into Russia.
Right.
And I think that's a mistake, in answer to your question. I think that, that if the Russians are firing at the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians have the ability to fire back, they should be able to. Mm-hmm. Now they are, and you referenced the Ukrainians firing at military targets. Let's be clear. Right. The Ukrainians are firing at military targets in Russia with their own weapons, with their own drones, which gets to your second question. Right. Because the Ukrainians are very resourceful and innovative, and have done amazing things with drones that is indeed changing the way people think about warfare. It is changing the warfare. Now, my friends here at this table and I were in the infantry in the Army. So this next little story, which is told to me by the head of the Ukrainian army, General Zaluzhny, before he was changed. He's now the ambassador in London, but at the time he was, when I was talking to him last fall, he was talking about tanks. And he was saying that the drone capabilities to identify targets, in particular tanks massing on one side of the border or the other, that the ability to see those tanks and to bring fire on those tanks, to shoot at those tanks, is so sophisticated now that the tank is dead. He said the tank is, yep, that's exactly what he said. The tank is obsolete. Now, in the history of warfare, military historians in this room will remind us that this is not the first time they've said that, because the tank made some changes and got more protected, and then bigger fires were brought. But the point is, General Zaluzhny said that because the drone capabilities allow you to see where these tanks are massing and to bring fire on them very accurately, that form of warfare was no longer possible. So they're thinking about other ways to do that. So it has, answer to your question, it has changed warfare a lot.
People are watching. Yeah.
People are watching.
Nation.
The Americans are learning.
Yeah.
The Europeans are learning. Yeah, absolutely.
What did you think about the news this morning that North Korea is supplying troops now to Russia?
So the North Koreans have been providing ammunition to the Ukrainians for some time. In particular, the artillery ammunition, 155 ammunition, that the North Korea, 152 ammunition, that...
To Russia. To Russia.
To the Russians.
Right.
Right, I'm sorry, to the Russians, exactly. For some time. In the millions of shells from North Korea to Russia, what the Ukrainians have determined, and what was reported this morning, was that the North Koreans are now sending soldiers. And this, one way to interpret that, one implication of that, is that the Russians are having a hard time themselves raising soldiers for their army. And what their Russian tactics have been has been to send wave after wave of poorly trained Russian soldiers into these fights up and down this area of Donbass right here. There have been some towns that we now know that have finally been taken. The Russians have finally pushed through after taking incredible casualties, like 1,000 soldiers a day. So 30,000 soldiers a month are being killed as the Russians pour them into this fight. And they are looking to see where else they can get soldiers. And if the North Koreans can provide them, then that's an indication that the Russians may have difficulties.
Thank you. We've been hearing a lot about, kind of diplomacy, peace negotiation, that there's a little bit more discussion about that, even in Ukraine.
So the Ukrainians have said from the beginning, and President Zelensky has been very articulate and forceful about this, that their goal is to retake all of the 1991 borders that we talked about. That is, the goal has been to push every Russian out of the country, push them out of Ukraine. And that's still the goal, let's be clear. That's still the intent. The question is, how does that happen? Part of that pushing of the Russians out continues to be militarily. And again, we're supplying a lot of the support, of the weapons, of the ammunition to enable the Ukrainians to do that. And they will continue to do that, and I think they will have some success at pushing the Russians back away from their current lines. But President Zelensky has also said that part of the taking back of every square meter
Yeah.
of Ukraine will be through discussions, negotiations. And again, what President Zelensky has said is when Putin realizes that the Ukrainians are not ever going to stop fighting, and when he realizes that the Europeans are going to continue to support the Ukrainians in that fight, and when he realizes that the Americans are going to continue to support the Ukrainians, then Putin, will look for a way out. When he realizes he cannot outlast this. That's his current strategy. Putin right now thinks he can just wait us out, that he's got more Russians than the Ukrainians have Ukrainians. And so he thinks he can just wait them out and wait for the Ukrainians to crack, no sign of that. Wait for the Europeans to crack, they've been pretty strong. Wait for the Americans to change. And so far, we've been strong.
Talked about the election, too.
We can talk about the election.
Yeah.
We can talk about the
What are
election.
your thoughts?
Wait, but still on your question about negotiations.
And winter is coming.
Winter is coming. November is coming.
Yeah.
No, that's right. But on negotiations, so the Ukrainians are not eager to talk about negotiations because that implies some compromise. That implies that they may not get all of their 1991. That implies that maybe some portion of that part of the map that's in red will be traded for something else, peace or some deal that will somehow freeze ceasefire in place. And the Ukrainians are not willing to give up territory. A larger number of Ukrainians now than even 2 months ago are thinking that maybe some conversation, negotiations with the Russians may be possible to end this war, but at the same time they say no compromise on territory. So it's not clear that either side, the Russians are not ready for that either. The Russians say we'll negotiate as long as Ukraine basically surrenders, and that's not happening.
Okay.
The election. So I work for an organization called the United States Institute of Peace, and it has a board of directors that is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and it has to be half and half Republicans and half Democrats. So what that means is I am nonpartisan. I'm not making any statements about the upcoming election. Plus, I'm also an independent, just myself, so I'm not on either side. But what I will say is that we know a fair amount about what Kamala Harris would do as president. I mean, she's been pretty clear about the strong support for Ukraine. It's less clear what Donald Trump would do. He has said that he'll resolve this in a day. The Ukrainians actually are a little bit worried about this because to solve it in a day might mean they have to just give up, compromise in ways that they don't want to compromise. But we don't really know. The other thing we do know is Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, when he was getting ready to pass or put to a vote this big support bill, Ukraine support bill, $61 billion, and he was hesitant, the Speaker was hesitant to bring that bill up on the floor of the House out of worry of what former President Trump might say about it. So he went down to Mar-a-Lago and had a conversation, and to his credit, former President Trump allowed this bill to move forward, and it passed. Bipartisan, overwhelming majority, it passed, which indicates to me, this is the last point on the politics, that the Congress and the American people support Ukraine. The American people say when they're asked, 60% will support Ukraine. The last big vote in the House and the Senate was bipartisan and strong support there for that $61 billion. And former President Trump allowed it to go forward. So hard to say exactly what that policy would be.
Right. Last question, then we'll open it up.
Open it up.
Because I see some anxious faces. Can you talk a little bit about NATO and what you know, the EU and NATO, what that whole package would look like.
So the Ukrainians are very eager to join NATO. They're very eager and are making some progress on joining the European Union, the EU. We were talking about the negotiations.
Right.
And the only way that the Ukrainians are willing to sit down and have some conversations with the Russians, the only way is if they are in or going to be in NATO.
Makes sense.
NATO is going to be the way to ensure that the Russians don't invade again. The Russians have not attacked, invaded any NATO nation. They've attacked non-NATO nations. They've attacked, obviously, Ukraine and Georgia. So the Ukrainians understand that their security depends on them being in NATO. I think that's possible for them to get for the Ukrainians to get an invitation to join NATO. Mm-hmm. I think that is possible. It'll mean a change in policy in Washington. Yeah. But I think I think they're considering it. I think that is possible. If that happens, we can probably convince the rest of the NATO alliance with some difficulty, and there's going to be some hard conversations, first with the Germans, and then with the Hungarians, and then even the Slovaks, and maybe even the Turks. But if we work it hard, I think it can get there. But that's going to be key for a peace, that the Ukrainians will have their security assured.
Yeah. And do you think that's a real possibility in the next year or two? Or?
I think it's
how hard would that be? Because you mentioned that it's actually harder to get in the EU, or?
It's getting into the EU takes a long time, and it's very complicated, and the steps that have to be taken are very well established, very well written down, and very clear to every applicant to join. The Europeans have already indicated to the Ukrainians that they're going to be in, and the Europeans have started the negotiations with the Ukrainians to enter. It's going to take time, and both sides know it. The NATO procedures are less clear. They can go quickly. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, again, big time, in 2022, two formerly neutral nations, the Finns and the Swedes, the Finns had been neutral for 50 years. The Swedes have been neutral for 200 years. Yeah. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the Finns and the Swedes figured out that neutrality doesn't help, doesn't stop them. And so they applied to and then joined NATO pretty quickly. The Finns very quickly, and the Swedes took some time because they had to again work with the Turks to get their agreement. But it can happen quickly. So I think it's very possible to give an invitation to the Ukrainians in the next 3 months. Oh. I mean, President Biden could do this. Wow. While he's still in office, he could invite the Ukrainians to start the process, negotiations toward membership. He could do that. They wouldn't come in for a while. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't come in until the war ends. Right. The Ukrainians are not going to come into NATO while there's an active fight, for obvious reasons. But they could start and they could be invited and on the track.
But isn't Putin just saying, like, you better not, or we're just going to go crazy? Or, I mean, Putin has basically drawn a line in the sand, hasn't he, about that?
But he has no vote. Putin has no say about whether Ukraine joins NATO. It's up to NATO and all the 32 nations, and up to Ukraine. Putin doesn't get a say in that. Though we should not listen to that bluster and bluff up in Moscow.
Oh, speaking about bluff, I missed the nuclear question. You think that he would use? I mean, there's always that saber rattling and.
So every time the United States has been faced with a question of should we provide the next level of equipment to the Ukrainians, whether it's Javelin missiles or it's the HIMARS artillery or whether it's the Abrams tanks, obsolete as they are. The F-16s, the long-range ATACMS, and the final decision was to use the shorter-range weapons at military targets in Russia. For every one of those decisions, President Putin tried to deter it, tried to stop it, tried to intimidate the Americans and the Europeans from making the decision to go up the next step by saying, don't forget, I've got nuclear weapons, and if you provide those F-16s, I might have to use nuclear weapons. We've called the bluff every time. And my own view is that while there is a non-zero chance that he has nuclear weapons. That's a fact. But militarily, it makes no sense to use a nuclear weapon. Politically, he would be a pariah, probably in his own nation, but also with the Chinese. The Chinese now are the big brother to the Russian little brother, and the Chinese have said, President Xi has said to President Putin, every time he makes these threats to use nuclear, President Xi has said, shut up. Don't talk about using nuclear weapons. Don't even talk about it. And so Putin, I think, has, and the last thing I'll say about nuclear weapons is that they may not work.
He's tried them.
He's tested a new missile, and it's blown up in the silo 3 times. So he may order the use of nuclear weapons, and it may not work. So he probably doesn't want to use that other test. All to say that I think the chances are very low.
That's good to know. I want to open it up for questions. Do you have any? Okay.
Right away. Are you going to call on, right?
Yeah. No, you can. I was going to grab a microphone. See, can you hear? Can you? And then, yeah. Matt,
Yep.
would you be the runner, Matt? I would appreciate it.
Is this on? Oh,
Yeah.
It is. Don't give me a microphone.
If you could, we were recording it, so it'd be helpful if you used it.
Wow, this is official. Hello.
Yeah.
Now,
Closer.
Ukraine, you said, could be very quickly put into the group. Now, would that be just the free Ukraine, or would that also, on paper, include the Ukrainian areas that Russia controls?
It's a great question.
You have to hold the mic up a little closer.
Did you hear the?
I heard the question, right.
Okay.
So the question is, if Ukraine gets into NATO, if I understand the question right, then there is a Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which says that attack on one NATO nation is attack on all NATO nations. And your question's a good one. If they come into NATO without controlling all of their territory, what does Article 5 apply to? It's a great question. We've had some experience with that. In 1954, West Germany came into NATO. East Germany was still dominated by the Soviet Union. And West Germany joined NATO, went on to develop into the European Union, developed its economy, its democracy. That same model could apply to the 80% of Ukraine that is not occupied, with the expectation, with the aspiration but expectation that eventually, like in West Germany, East Germany, it would be reunited. Ukraine would be reunited. But you're exactly right. The Article 5 guarantee would apply to the 80% of Ukraine that is not occupied by the Russians. That's a great question. Yeah.
Is it on? Hello. This war has gone on a long time. Do you see a timetable here at all of when it might get to the point of negotiations, or how long do you foresee this continuing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it depends a lot on us. Let's be clear. If we continue to provide the Ukrainians the capability to be pushing the Russians back. Military capability, military weapons, ammunition, if we provide the Ukrainians with that ability to push the Russians back so that Putin realizes that he cannot win, the other part of what we need to do is keep the political pressure on Putin and the economic pressure on Putin. And if that happens, then President Zelensky, who is trying to answer your question, because he wants to answer it for his people too, they're asking the same question, how can we get to an end of this? And he says that by 2025, he sees a way for the pressure on Putin to be such that Putin will want to come to the table and have the negotiation. So if you ask President Zelensky, he would say 2025. As I mentioned, Putin's strategy is to wait us out in hopes that somebody, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, the Americans will crack, or that some political change will work in his favor. That would change the calculation. But it is possible that next year, with the right push from the West, they could see some negotiations for at least that's 80% that we're talking about here.
Next question for Ambassador Taylor, right?
Bill, you said that the Russians are losing about 1,000 a day, 30,000 a month. What is the Ukrainian losses?
So it's a good question, Bobby. We don't know. Those estimates of the Russian losses come from the British military, from the Ukrainian military, and others who have observed that. The Ukrainians are very careful not to talk about their casualties. What we can say is there are a lot of casualties, but we can also say that they are less than the Russians, just because the Russian tactics, as I mentioned, are just to run these large formations of poorly trained Russian soldiers into the face of well-prepared positions, and they lose 1,000, 1,200 a day.
One of the things that I find strange about the Ukrainian self-defense is that I understand that their draft is only age 25 and above. And I think about the Americans, historically, we send off people who are too young to vote, 18 to 25-year-olds mainly. Why is the Ukrainian age so high?
I will give you the answer that I understand. But the people at this table right over here may be able to answer the question for you as well. Fact is, you want to answer that? Go ahead. I'd love to hear.
Matt, you want to go over?
Yeah.
With some very, very...
Walking very fast. Microphone.
Hi, I'm Svetlana. I'm local. I'm also
Closer to your mouth.
I'm also a co-founder of Leleka Foundation. We've been providing tactical medicine to frontlines for 10 years. So one of the reasons why the draft at 25 is because we don't have even enough training facilities. So at the moment when the full-scale invasion started, just imagine we're a country that we didn't have a proper army. We don't have training facilities. We barely can train people that are drafted right now. We use Great Britain to train people. We use other countries like Finland and in Europe that help to train people. We don't even have enough. Just send them as the meat. We are not Russians. We care about our people. We want to send people that are well-trained and well-equipped. Another problem, we don't have enough weapon. Like, what's the reason to have people that when we don't have enough weapon, we don't have enough tactical medicine? It literally will be just meat that we're sending into the war. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. The other thing that I've heard, Svetlana, and tell me if this is right, that the Ukrainians, as you say, care about their soldiers, care about their people. Ukrainians also care about the development of their country, of their nation, of their people, and they want to give the young men and women the ability to have families because they care about where their country is going to be, and they don't want to miss a generation. But you're right. It's a different philosophy than women. Yes, sir. Yeah. Hold on.
Hi, my name is Roman. I would like to add something to Svetlana's
Please.
words. So maybe it's not only my word, it's from the Zaluzhny, journalist Zaluzhny. He worried about the keep young people because those generation which was born after 1991, it's a completely different mind, not Soviet Union mind. It's one of important reason too.
That's a good point.
Thank you.
I think it's a very good point.
Yeah.
It's a very good point. So the Ukrainians who have been born since or grown into, maturity since 1991, it's a whole different generation. It's a whole different mindset.
They've been born into democracy.
They've been born into freedom. No, that's exactly right. No, thank you, Roman.
Vicki, did you have a question? Vicki?
Ambassador Taylor, thank you for this evening tonight. And actually, something that you said before prompted me to ask this question. So you said pressure on Putin will hopefully create a platform for some negotiation in the future. Do you think the pressure has been enough?
No, not yet. It will be enough when he decides that he can't win, and he's not there yet. So
and he is successfully challenging international law by entering countries like Mongolia, planning a trip to Brazil, where very much unlikely he will be stopped. So, in your opinion, what is stopping the world, and I guess the United States as being the, unofficial international police, right, from putting that pressure that will put him, pressure him to go to the negotiation table and back off?
In other words, what do you think it's going to take?
yeah, it's going to require the Ukrainians to be able to push the Russians back to some degree. If you're going into a negotiation, it can't be a stalemate. It's got to be the Ukrainians are going to have the momentum. And that momentum is on the battlefield, and that's going to mean we need to provide the weapons and the ammunition to do that, and the authority to shoot at military targets in Russia. That's going to be important. But then there's an economic pressure as well, which we've tried and to some degree succeeded. The sanctions haven't forced Russia yet to the negotiating table. However, they've reduced the economy. They've reduced the Russian economy is now being driven by a war economy. He's now putting a quarter of his entire budget into the war. So that's the kind of pressure that's going to be required to be able to push it. Now, in terms of policing the world, that makes me a little nervous here because the world's a big place. But you made the point that Putin was able to go to Mongolia, as an example, when he should not have been able to land there because Mongolia is a member of the international agreement, the Rome Treaty, that says if you're a war criminal, like Putin is an indicted war criminal, and if you go to a country that has signed on to the Rome Treaty, the International Criminal Court, you're supposed to arrest him and send him to The Hague, and they didn't. Victoria, is that right? Victoria, you would have the Americans go into Mongolia and force them to arrest Putin. Or something. My point is, there are limits to what we can do. In a perfect world. In a perfect world.
She wants it now.
That's good.
Yeah.
We have another one over here.
Sir.
I guess color me naive, but doesn't this check all of the boxes for why the United Nations was created?
So the question is about the United Nations. This is what the United Nations was supposed to have been created for, right? The basic the basic role, fundamental purpose of the United Nations was to stop aggression, stop wars. Indeed, I was talking about the principles that actually succeeded in deferring and deterring war, preventing war for 1945 until 2014 were the UN principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, the Russians, as one of 5 members, permanent members of the UN Security Council, violated it. And then the question has come back victorious. How do you enforce it? How do you enforce that? So the question is the UN useful? Certainly not the Security Council, not in this case. So the question is, how do what are steps you can take on that thing? Todd, I don't know if you got some thoughts on the UN. You've spent some time thinking about these kind of things, but it's a great question. I think the UN is really crippled, certainly the Security Council. Sir, a Navy.
He's got one right back here.
A Navy. Oh, hang on. Here it
Hold
comes.
on.
Here it comes. It's coming.
We'll get him a microphone.
You know this man in the back.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any solution to this continuing crisis? Any solution seems that it will stretch out to at least 2025, possibly later. What is your assessment of the morale of the civilian population and of the military of the country? Can they stick it out that long?
So again, I'm going to ask our Ukrainian colleagues here this question, and if you could hear the question is, how would you describe the morale of Ukrainians at this point, after 967 days, after 2 years and 8 months of fighting? I'll tell you my observation, but I'd love to get your thoughts of your families or your friends that you talk to back in Ukraine, is they're tired. They're exhausted. It's not just the military that is fighting this, it's the society. And the society has been extraordinary in their support for the soldiers on the front line. I talked to, again, probably a lot of families who take their, whatever they make and provide some of that directly to brigades on the front line. And they will fund drones for some of these brigades. And why is that? Because the morale, because of the determination of the Ukrainians not to be defeated by the Russians. And the Ukrainians know that if they're defeated, that there's no Ukraine. That's Putin's intent, is to defeat the Ukrainians and thus wipe out Ukraine as a nation. So they're tired, exhausted, but motivated. I've got good friends in the Army. Probably people on this table here have some good friends in the Army as well. And every time I go, the last week and in September when I was there, I sit down and talk with them all the time. They are tired, but motivated still. It's grim, it's hard. But any thoughts on the morale question back in Ukraine?
We actually have a lot of memes on this topic.
I bet.
But yes, we're tired. A lot of people are tired, exhausted. But the thing is, what maybe the rest of the world don't understand, if we give up, Ukraine as a nation will stop to exist. And we know that. This been happening for centuries. My grandma, who was 103 years old, died last year. And I've been raised with a lot of real stories how her childhood was during the World War II. And we know that it's not a question like what will happen. It's a question like, will we exist as a nation at all? And if you think that if Ukraine will fail and Putin will stop on Ukraine, he will not. We know that, and I'm not sure the rest of the world understands that, but we trying to protect everyone by price of our lives, our future, our children, And the fact that he is targeting civilians and Russian army is targeting civilians, it's a genocide. So yes, we're tired, yes, we're exhausted, but we don't have a choice. We don't have an option to be like sleeping in a bed and be like, oh, will I wake up today or not? What do I want to do? No, you just go and do wherever is possible. A lot of people, unfortunately, that exit Ukraine and live in other countries, they are sad. They want to go back, but they have to build life in a different country. But everyone supports Ukraine and trying to do wherever is possible. From the other side, we do feel like we are alone because, there are a lot of countries that saying, we support you. We will wave you. Please go ahead and win. But even with weapon, we cannot target military targets deep in Russia. We cannot do, what kind of support is that? And that's why there is a part of being really tired, devastated, but we don't have a choice. That's it.
Thank you.
Well said. Got a couple questions on this side of the room. I'm going to start with Bob.
What can a negotiation look like if Ukraine has kind of laid their red line down, we want the 91 borders, we want Crimea back? How does Putin not admit total defeat for his nation and for his ego? What does he negotiate?
So, Bob, it's a great question. I mentioned that President Zelensky has now begun to talk about what will eventually be negotiations. He's not talking about that yet, but he talks about a conversation, talking about discussions, talking about at some. He's talking about forcing Putin to come to Ukraine, to come to Zelensky, and seek negotiations. But then President Zelensky has said that it may not be possible to get back all of that red and pink part militarily. But he says we're going to get it back. He does want to go back to 1991 borders. He recognizes that part of that will be, part of taking that back will be done with the army, but part of it will be negotiation. And so then your question's a good one about what is, first of all, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what Putin gets. I mean, this is his problem. He started this in 2014, and he can get himself out as far as I'm concerned. But he could tell a story to the Russian people if he were to at least temporarily control that 20% of Ukraine. He could say, look, I took back some territory from Ukraine. It's our traditional Novorossiya from times past. And if we can get something like what the Norwegians did. When the Norwegians went into NATO, they said, we're not going to put any NATO bases on Norwegian soil. The Ukrainians might consider that, what the Norwegians did. The Ukrainians might consider not stationing nuclear weapons on the 80% that they totally control. They would be going into NATO. They say, look, I got the Ukrainians to say they would not have naval bases and there would not be nuclear weapons. There are stories that Putin could tell. Putin controls the media and message so completely that he can convince.
So you talked about the changing tools of war with drones and tanks, but it's fascinating to me, and I'd love your thoughts on how effective President Zelensky's been at using the media.
Media. So the information war is full scale. President Zelensky has been, again, I'm really interested in Ukrainians' views of this, but President Zelensky, from the beginning, has used his voice in the media, in the international media, to rally support from the beginning. But the second or third day of the big invasion, and all Ukrainians know Bunkos, where the president's office is. And there's some very distinctive buildings on Bunko that all Ukrainians recognize. And in this third day of this full-scale invasion, where the Russians were bearing down on Kyiv, President Zelensky went out there with a couple of his people, took a video selfie, and said to the Ukrainian people, "Yatu, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And that message went to the Ukrainians, it went to the rest of the world, said, "You stay." He also famously, as the Russians were bearing down, the Americans went in and said to President Zelensky, "You know, Mr. President, you're really important to us. We need you to lead your country. So if you want us to take you to the Carpathian Mountains, away from where the Russians are, or into Poland, we can do that." And he said, again, famously, was attributed to him, he said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." And again, that's that kind of message. And every day since then, so what did I say, 967 days, he has made a statement, a video. It's gone out to the people of Ukraine. I'd be interested in Ukrainians' view about this. For 967 times, he's been out there with that message, with a message. And so often, I've heard a bunch of them. Often it's to thank the soldiers that are on the front line, or thank the first responders who are digging people out of the rubble caused by the Russian attacks. So he has done that over and over. Now, the information war is going on the other side too. Putin, as I said, dominates the information space in Russia, but he also tries misinformation, disinformation in Europe and in the United States. So it's a big part of the war. I don't know if Ukrainian friends have any thoughts about the information warfare that's going on. If not, not a problem.
Yeah, a couple things I wanted to mention, and if I've got the story right, I understand Russia, when it became a country, the capital was Kyiv, and
this is
from
a
Kyiv,
great question. This is a very good question.
And then from Kyiv, it expanded, and the country expanded, and then became the capital in Moscow. So it's not a black and white thing. There's more to the story, and also, Russia, when they lost the satellite states, Romania and Poland and everybody, they lost all their defensive positions because that part of Europe is just like Barstow. And you just roll right into Moscow with all your tanks and military, and they've got no defensive, they've got no mountains or oceans or anything. So the 6 or 7 wars that he's had so far since he's been in office have all been to secure those points that he lost when the Soviet Union broke apart and lost satellite countries. So if he gets Ukraine back, Poland, Romania they're the next points that will be taken back.
This is exactly what she said. You're exactly right.
Right.
But also, I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Also on the history, which is great. You want to do the history, or shall I do that? You should do the history.
I can suggest Timothy Snyder.
Yeah.
Ukrainian history is so rich. And
Hold on.
Wait, I can shout.
You don't have to shout.
You know what, kind of sad a little bit, but also it's, for me, is kind of a segue to explain how rich and how old Ukrainian history and culture is. But since we don't have a lot of time, Timothy Snyder has amazing videos about history of Ukraine, starting from early ages. I strongly suggest to look at that, and you can truly understand where we're coming from and how rich we are as a nation, as a country, as people that have way more history than Russia. When Moscow was literally, fields, we already had our capital and a lot of Ukrainian cities. Please watch that. It's amazing.
And also, if we should put back Ukraine, I guess we should put back Eastern Germany too.
Right.
Hold on.
And maybe for those who like reading books, there's an excellent book. It's called The Gates of Europe, which is exactly what Ukraine has been doing for centuries, and right now is fighting to, to preserve that title. So, yeah.
So just one quick elaboration on this history, that it is a rich history. So the people who have been to Ukraine, have been to Kyiv, all of you have, will know, will remember St. Sophia's, this beautiful cathedral. Now Golden Dome, it was built originally as part of Kievan Rus, this society, this civilization that was in Ukraine and in the 9th and 10th centuries. So the St. Sophia's was built in like 1058. It was completed in 1058, which indicates that it was a very sophisticated, advanced civilization, and culminated in that cathedral. In 1058, Moscow was a swamp, was a forest. There was no Moscow. And so that's why Ukrainians are the older brother. The Russians, as you say, are the younger one. But there's a strong history there that the Ukrainians know well.
Okay, if I don't let Jen ask a question, I won't sleep tonight.
Thank you. Hey, I just want to say to both of you, love, country, faith, public service. This is amazing. And I want to have the room recognize what you're doing here, number one.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. My first question is, you've come out of public service before, out of retirement to serve your country. Would you do so again?
In a minute.
Amazing.
Yeah.
This is from the Colonel. My father. He's saying, I'm not sure whether giving up Crimea would stop the Russians or encourage more aggression. I'd be more interested to hear his take on whether your defense posture is strong enough to deal with potential conflict with China, North Korea, Iran, Middle East, and Europe, Russia, looking at weakened armed forces and a killer national debt. Let's go.
All right, Jen. So let me just take a little piece of that. Let me just take a part of that. In particular, the China angle that he asked about. You have to think that the Chinese, President Xi, is watching what's going on in Ukraine for all kinds of reasons. President Xi may have noticed that President Putin was counting on a very strong army, very strong military, and it failed him. And the army wasn't as strong as President Putin thought. President Xi might be having second thoughts about his army as well, maybe looking to see if it's as strong as he thinks it is, number one. But number two, President Xi is probably looking to see how President Putin does against Ukraine and whether the Americans and the Europeans will stand by the Ukrainians. Because if the Americans and Europeans don't stand by the Ukrainians, then they probably won't stand by the Taiwanese either. And the Chinese then would have reason to think that they could use force on that as well. There's one other little point for your father on this. It's a good question. So we've provided, in terms of military support to Ukraine, we've provided about $61 billion in U.S. support. Most of which, by the way, is manufactured in this country. These are weapons and ammunition manufactured in Pennsylvania and in Arizona, and then provided, $61 billion were provided to the Ukrainians. $61 billion is about 7% of our overall defense budget. Okay? So our overall defense budget is about $848 billion every year. And its design, that $848 billion, is to protect us from the Russians and the Chinese. And for 7% of that defense budget, the Ukrainians have stopped the Russians and have destroyed half of the ground forces of the Russians. So people say, rightly, that $61 billion is a lot of money, but it's 7% of our defense budget, and it is stopping the Russians there. And there are other things that we have to do, and we can do, and in this country. I mean, we have needs in this country. There's absolutely no doubt about it. We can do both. For 7% of our defense budget, they are stopping the Russians for us, and we can support that. Thank your father for that good question.
During the first year of the war,
2014 or in 2022?
2022.
Okay, so
there were many families and individuals fundraising and asking for donations for personal protective gear out in the front line, including equipment to build trenches in the middle of winter, things of that sort. Is that still an issue, considering how much has been donated?
It is still an issue. It is still an issue. But you're right. In the beginning, there was the incredible need for everything, for weapons, for protective gear, for equipment that you described on trench building and fortifications that came from all over. It continues to come. But there's still, absolutely still a need for that. Now, the flow of that kind of support from Europe and from the United States has now picked up. So it should have been faster, but it has picked up. But the need still is there. I don't know if you all have any other thoughts on that, but that is.
I'm going to go right here.
Bob Yap gets a second question here.
Got two of them for you, Bill.
All right.
Just one now.
Just one.
I see the pink and red area there, and I've heard it said before that those people affiliate more with the Russian side. I know a lot of them speak Russian in there, but is that really true? I mean, they've seen what Ukraine can do and how well they've done as a Western country. Do they associate more with the Russians or with the Ukrainians?
Bob, it's a good question. And again, there will be answers from back here already. I have a couple, but these are much more authentic. Yes. How would you answer Bobby Yap's question?
I guess I will speak on behalf of my mom, who passed away last year. Taking the toll of war and constant bombings was too much for her.
Where did she live?
I was born in Odessa, but my mom was born in Donetsk.
So Donetsk is right here.
That's an occupied area.
Occupied area.
Her entire family was from Donetsk. And when I was growing up, she spoke to me Ukrainian. She was a teacher of Ukrainian language and literature. And her entire family always opposed an oppression from Russian side. It's a very small percentage of people who are possibly backing up Russia for their own convenience, possibly for their safety. People who are backing up Russia truly in their heart, they probably moved to Russia by now. So there's a lot of crime that goes on in that area because we still have relatives there, unfortunately. They're elderly, it's hard for them to move. They do not welcome Russia, they did not ask for Russia to be there. And that's just a testimony that comes, just from my family. I'm going to pass it on to Svetlana.
The war hasn't started in 2014. That started centuries ago. During Soviet Union, Russian language artificially was forced to Ukraine by moving Ukrainian people to Siberia, by moving Russian people to Ukrainian territory and spreading Russian books. In 1920, the executed Renaissance when Soviet Union sorry, I'm a little bit nervous, leadership just killed Ukrainian poets, just killed Ukrainian artists. They forced Russian culture on Ukraine. That's how it happened. It's not like people that live near Donetsk really wanted to learn Russian. They were put in those boxes where Russian was everywhere. And that's why it is the way it is right now. And at some point, it is our fault that we allowed that. But no mistake here, Russian is not dumb. It was planned for centuries. And Soviet Union, this is all the Soviet Union result. And Putin just taking advantage of that. Please remember, it was on purpose killing Russian were killing Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian culture. That's how we got here.
Let me add something about Donbass. I too have a relative there. And even in 1954-55, all government documents in Donbass were on Ukrainian language. So it's about maybe 70 years ago they did this. I mean, the language, to erase Ukrainian language from the documents, from schools, etc. If we will talking about some parts of Ukraine, like Crimea or Donbass, it's tough to talk, it's not enough time to speak about that. If you talk about Crimea, Crimea should be Greek, not Russian. So when we goes back, we never find the end. We should see it in the future. So when the Second World War ended, the good countries in the world got agreement to try to live without war. No more killing people. And we should stay on it. So I should say sorry about maybe our maybe a little forced behavior because we have many emotions. But Ukrainians very thankful and very grateful for all nations who support us, especially for U.S. nation. Because without U.S., we can't beat them.
Thank you. Are you ready? Yes. Oh, excuse me. Bill, we have a custom at St. James. We like to mug people. So we're mugging you and kissing you at the same time.
Don't worry. Don't worry, Ambassador.
Thank you so much for being with us. I want to be respectful of people's time, but let's give it for Bill for coming all the way. Thank you. Thank you so much.